I'm going to introduce Marta, who I've had a pleasure working with throughout the time of this creation, of this presentation. And Marta comes to us with a really interesting background that involves forestry and ecology with economics. So we're really lucky to have her expertise in the room to combine those fields. And she's going to talk more about how she got to the place that she is and what she can, how she can share that with us. So, so without further ado, thank you, Marta, and thank you, everyone.
Well, thanks, Karen. So this is fantastic to be here. I've been here before in previous evenings. Always great topics, engaged, informed audience. So kudos for the organizers to do all of this for the community. So that's fantastic. I'm the executive director of the Donella Meadows Institute. We are based in Norwich, and it was not always the case. We were based before at Cobb Hill, and I have the pleasure to have two Cobb Hillers here, or over there actually, new friends. That's great. So I'll meet with you guys later. I'm very pleased to see you guys here. So our institute was founded by Donella Meadows in 1996, and at the time she called it Sustainability Institute, and indeed was part of this vision of having a living farm, a sustainable community, and a living example of how to live with a vision of sustainability on the land. And with our move to Norwich, we want to, I guess, exemplify and show our interest in being more present in the community and being available for the community to come to us. Sometimes just people seeing the big sign that we have in Norwich of our institute, people just come in, and we have this policy of just welcoming everybody at any time, so don't hesitate to come and visit. Also another change, we changed our name, and that was to of course honor Dana's work, Dana's thinking, her legacy, and one of the core parts of our mission is keeping her work alive, accessible, more and more known by wider audiences. So we have specific activities for doing that. We have a lot of her work actually available online, digitized versions of a lot of her publications, including the most, stratospherically known, which is Limits to Growth. And so the first edition actually is all digitized and online. And so that's a big part of the work we do. Another big part that we thought was very important to actually, start delving deeper in is that of envisioning and starting to discuss and design a really sustainable economy, starting from place, starting from where we live, starting from our communities, from our regions. And that is because a lot of the discussion about sustainability gets stuck in the economic system. That's where a lot of the good work that we all do sort of hits the limits to what we can do to change actually our world into a more sustainable world. So before I keep talking about our work, I just want to focus for a little bit on the reasons why we are here, and then you'll learn more about what we are doing at our institute. The more I speak, the more I give you examples. So if I want to read the whole thing, the title is a mouthful. It's long. There's a lot of things packed in there. So there's also assumptions. I come here with assumptions. Well, one big assumption is that there is a place in ourselves where we feel that sense of caring more than anywhere else, where that sense of caring has a particular way to manifest ourselves and inform ourselves. Also, I come with the realization that caring means a lot. It means not just being good neighbors, good friends, good parents. It means actually to be able to shape and design our community, our world, the way it really matters to us. And so I have this maybe naive assumption that if we can design systems based on how strongly and deeply we care, then a lot of change naturally happens without having to really use the whip to educate people and use the whip on ourselves to do the good work that we need to do. So it's basically trying to get in touch with that place of caring from where all the energy can actually flow, inspiration, and really listening deeply to people. So that is where I'm coming from with this. And I experimented myself a path of coming more from the rational side of me and then trying to get more and more in touch with that place of caring. So I'm not here with recipes or frameworks. I'm here to share a story that possibly can be spurring a discussion here. So lastly, there's other words that are kind of important here. I use narrative interchangeably with stories. So stories, narratives. And the assumption there is that the way we talk about things, the way we tell stories, informs the way we think. And so stories capture essentially our interpretation of the world. So they are very important, and we'll talk more about that. The other big word in there is collective action. So building a narrative for collective action. Because there's no change at this point. We are so deep in the complexity and the thickness of the problems that we have to face, there's no way we have simple problems left. All these easy problems have been solved. We have to deal with complex problems. So there's no single complex problem from your family to society to the economy that can be dealt in isolation or in silos. It all happens by using a collective impact approach or collective action in which many sectors, many people at all levels get involved to address issues. So that is very, very important too. So that took a while for the first slide. But I just want to give you a sense of how I'd like to organize this evening. Also being mindful that we started a little late, which was wonderful. Also me being Italian and never being completely on time. So part one, I would like to spend the rest of the hour that we have to talk a little bit more about maybe our work at the Institute, but I did that a little bit already. So maybe we'll talk more about the power of stories, and then a little bit of work that we did in October at the Alameda's Institute on providing a sense of the possible in Vermont by looking at some of these stories in Vermont. And then a second part, which I hope is going to use up 1 hour of our time, is actually trying to get in touch, get connected with that place of caring by doing a guided meditation exercise. I should disclose that I'm not a therapist, and that you know that. But I asked a friend of mine to actually help me learn a little bit of that and see how we do it. I'll tell you more about that. It was an interesting experience. But at any rate, sort of connect to that sense of caring and place of caring, and then take a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, to sort of record down how that felt. And I'll give you more details before we engage into that exercise, so you don't have to worry about it now. And then if we feel like sharing, if we feel that we would like sharing that experience, it might become very personal, we don't know. But it's a safe place, it's a place that has been sort of cultivated to be safe, very masterfully. So we will share, and after that we will break into groups, maybe 4 or 5 people, and then in that group work we'll do a little bit of group storytelling. I'll give you more details at that time. And then regroup and capture some of these stories. All right, next. So I already mentioned a little bit about who we are at the Alameda's Institute. Let me just mention 2 things. I wanted to read how Dana actually described herself, because I think it's brilliant. She described herself as an opinionated columnist, perpetual fundraiser, fanatic gardener, opera lover, baker, farmer, teacher, and global gadfly. So I love that. It doesn't really tell, I was born here, I went to grad school there. That's fantastic, right? And of course, she doesn't mention that she's just the most brilliant systems thinker in the world, but that's not her story. And to me, she is an example of a person who cared, and not only she cared, because many of us care, but she had that channel open for herself to the place of caring. So for me, that is very important. And that is exemplified by also the continuous quest for how to better communicate that connection, for better bringing other people into that story of caring. So that for me is very valuable. I mentioned limits to growth. An interesting thing that is happening, just as in terms of news. So we have actually 2 screenings of a movie that came out very recently called Last Call, which is about the history of limits to growth and how that was perceived. And as you probably know, the Limits to Growth that came out in 1972 is the first attempt really of simulating what happens to a finite world if you start having an exponential population growth, industrial output growth, and other exponential growth as a consequence of those trends, which is what basically we observe now. So this story is quite interesting, and actually the movie is being shown in DC March 28th at the Environmental Films Festival, and then we'll come to the Upper Valley. We'll have one showing in Heartland at Damon Hall, and you can talk to Chuck Benton, who's here as actually the main organizer for that. And then we're going to have a second showing at Dartmouth on April 1st, the Black Family Center. And so here are some details. And talk to me or Chuck or Andy Kuczynski also in the audience about these showings. And lastly, in this slide, I wanted to mention, I don't know if all of you know, Thinking in Systems is like this book that came out posthumous after Dana died on, essentially is a handbook on system thinking, but it's very accessible, very interesting, and those are the 2 sort of milestones that we want to also promote and remind people about. Next one, thank you. So, all these words about systems thinking, and I'm not going to give a lecture really on systems thinking, but I think one aspect that is relevant for this discussion, especially on stories and narratives, is one way to depict the way that systems manifest themselves. And so you can think of systems as start really small with your family, or with your community, with your organization. So those are examples of systems. But the idea that you also have interconnected parts that give rise to a structure, and then structure generates behaviors. And ultimately the way we think about the world influences on how we actually design the structure of systems. Forget about sort of more theoretical side of things right now, but I think the iceberg metaphor is an important image to keep in mind, because we are going to talk tonight about a level of awareness that oftentimes is kind of missing from the work that many of us do, or maybe we do work at that deeper level, but maybe what we miss is the support from the larger system to really do that kind of deeper work. And let's see what I mean by that. So one level in which systems manifest themselves is through events, different facts, different things that are separated and that we can capture. Think of the news, for example. Think of, you hear that the GDP goes up, you hear that the school budget was not approved, you hear many things, and then you capture that information. And then, using maybe the example of the school budget again, because we had town meeting day this week, and so some towns are happier than others about their school budgets, of course. Think of behaviors that they could emerge from a system, and you start seeing connections. Oh, maybe we have a school budget that was not approved. Maybe that was because people over in that region or in that town, they were not particularly appreciative of, let's say, education, or there may be other different reasons. Or if you start actually having a higher quality school in your community, which is an issue that actually we are facing in Enfield, where I live. And it's like one worry is that if schools, for example, get to a higher quality, then maybe property taxes will also go up because it's going to become a more desirable neighborhood, and therefore property taxes are going to go up, and you start that sort of vicious cycle of gentrification. And so that's a behavior that could be observed and could emerge, and if we use that example. Or we can think of the structure that is behind actually the way we have decided to raise funding for our schools. We decided to do that through property taxes. That's a structural choice that we made, for example. So the system manifests itself, the system of the school, the community around the school manifests itself through also structure. And even more importantly from a change perspective, so something who wants to bring change to the system, is the way we think about education. And it could be, using that example, that we wonder whether we value or not education to the point of designing policies that make education accessible for people. So that is a way to really go through a sort of a hierarchy of levels of information and entry points for action. So where do you want to be active? What is the most leverage point? What is the highest leverage point in all of this? If we use any example, it could be education, healthcare, it could be any sort of system that you go about. So to me, the next one, this level of mindset, and it's not just to me obviously, is the level in which the most change can happen, but also it's very hard to change. It's change that can happen through subtle shifts of awareness. So that's what we try to always sort of recognize. What is the next level of awareness shift that we can create in order to achieve the largest scale change? And in that sense, stories are very relevant here. The stories being interpretation of reality, they really represent the mindsets and can access the mindsets. But stories, if they're not connected to a heart or a place of caring, are just empty stories, or maybe feel-good stories. So the secret, the real secret, is accessing mindsets, capturing mindsets from a place of caring. That's why I think stories, by reaching hearts and connecting to people, have the highest leverage in this case. Let's move to the next. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the power stories. And I'm going to use the example of the transition to a new vision for an economic system, because that's what I focus a lot on at the Metals Institute. And as I mentioned, it's sort of the main course when we think about our world, and many other things, education, healthcare, they become as side dishes. Remember. Next one. So essentially, stories are representations of how we see the world, as I mentioned. I just already mentioned that already. Let's keep continuing. Stories, one important aspect of stories is that they help us determine what we see and what we believe is possible. So that sense of possibility is also embedded in stories. And again, using the example of economics that I mentioned before, I really feel that conventional economics describes reality in a way that really limits our imagination. So the story that you hear about, being about growth, about jobs, and it's so, you say trite?
Yeah.
Trite, safe. And it's just not completely uninspiring. At any rate, let's go to the next. So I want to bring the attention to two concurrent observations or stories, as we want. At this very moment of transition that we observe, we can say the economic system is failing people and planet. I mean, there's no doubt that this system is not working, right? And we have seen, I don't have to go through the reasons why. It's very brilliantly captured in this visual, actually, of the 99% basically rowing to support the 1%. And I think that's kind of brilliant. At the same time, we are at a transition moment in which a vision for something different, very different, is emerging. And I'm sure you guys recognize this image. This is coming from the transition movement, right? So we are at this incredibly dissonant point in time in which we see that something is not working, a system is failing, something is emerging, but maybe we don't feel that it's emerging fast enough, or maybe it's emerging in sparse places around the world in a hidden way. By the way, whatever experimentation that happens, whatever success that happens, there's really no incentive in the current system to really sort of tell that story. I was on the phone a while ago with the Northern Forest Center. They are doing incredible work on, for example, cooperatives for wood burning and wood burning energy generation. And I mentioned, so are you actually capturing these stories? Are you propagating these models? And the answer was no, we don't have the resources. They get the funding to do the good work, but then nobody has the funding to tell the stories. Guess what? What happens is that we miss out. We miss out on all the good stuff because it's not funded. And instead, the old failing system, choking system, is still there perpetuating itself with great access, of course, to all the media and all the ways to perpetrate itself. Let's move to the next. So from a narrative point of view, from a storytelling point of view, it's actually quite interesting to observe these concurrent realities that we are living in. By the way, we are kind of very lucky to see this, because we could have just lived I don't know, at the beginning of the economic boom after the wars and just feel great. And we are at a very special time, right? Seeing this transition actually happen. So we could work from a narrative point of view on the current reality, and we could imagine that that new stuff that is coming up and popping up and ripening, it's our vision. Let's keep going, it's an animation. And so we are living that sort of structural tension between the current reality and the vision. And it's not easy. It's very uncomfortable, because we know that we are failing here. Everything we want together. So we know that the current economic system is failing people on the planet. But then the vision, I'm sorry, can you go back one? The vision, let's call the vision the new economic paradigm fosters welfare of people and planet with a typo. It's not a sort of catchy vision for the way it's spelled, but let's forget about that for a second. So we are feeling that tension. It's there. It's really present, and sometimes it's very painful. So I don't know how many people did read the article on drug addiction. It was on the first page of New York Times. How many? So yesterday, front page of New York Times was Bennington, Vermont, with the problem of drug addiction. So I read the article. It was very well written. It was painful. There was this photo of a young woman, 23 years old, just supposedly clean from drugs, 23 years old with 2 children, and looking really terrible. So what is your first reaction? You get a punch in the stomach, and so but then it's really hard to deal with that current reality. What is the vision there? So trapped in between the current reality and the vision is that pain as well. Let's keep on. So from a narrative point of view, it's quite interesting actually to think that creative tension, so that goes towards the vision. So what if we focus on the vision and we use that tension creatively? Yes, let's keep on going. And what if instead we have that stressful tension, that in the stomach that we get when we get the bad news and we want to do something about it? So if we follow sort of that loop up there, following our creative tension towards the vision, then we focus on what we want to create versus what we don't want to create. And we can keep going. And so we end up creating in one way, and in the other way we focus on problem solving. And one way towards the vision is a generative orientation, and another way to focus on problem solving is actually a reactive orientation. So a lot of the stories can be framed in this way because we are at this moment of friction, right? So some stories are framed this way, some stories are phrased this way, or framed this way. What happens with problem solving? Problem solving is good at the moment that you need, of course, to react to a problem. But how long can you actually keep going with that problem solving attitude? Problem solving sort of mobilizes some type of energy ourselves that are the energies of a crisis, of an emergency. So what we do is we react in a fearful way, or we have all those sentiments that are very hard to sustain over time. So for people who are at work, especially here in this audience, how long can you sustain that energy? Oftentimes we get burned out. So it's so common for change makers or caregivers, people who care, to get that burning, right? And so if we wanted to sustain this change and this transition to a new model, not just doing the economy, designing the economy, but all the work that we try to do in different systems, we have to find a more sustainable way to engage our energy over time. And so that is the power of the vision. So that's why I think it's extremely important to go and tap into that particular space where your energy is sustained over time. Because the work that we have ahead of us is actually long-term. It doesn't go away. The problem we have, the problems we have don't go away very quickly. So let's go to the next one. So I just want to reflect also on this idea of paradigm shifting. And this is completely based on Nina's work. So just to bring us back to where she was with her thinking. So one way of shifting a paradigm is to identify anomalies and failures of the old paradigm. And that's the sort of the kind of problem-solving attitude that we discussed. Another one, the next, which I really love and which I identify really with, is speak and act loudly and with assurance from the new paradigm. So that's very powerful. And let's keep going. So we focus on the first two so far. We're not going to focus too much on the remaining ones, but nevertheless interesting to look at. And place people with a new paradigm in places of power. That's also very important. And a very good piece of advice. Don't waste time with the reactionaries. Focus on active agents of change and the middle ground majority. How many times we tend to speak to the outliers, to the different sides of the spectrum, right? And we ignore the more silent, oftentimes, but more reasonable majority. And I've encountered that a lot in my work. Great. So I'm confirming what comes next. Yes. So this is an example of the fact that we have done a lot in terms of identifying the failures of the system. There's a lot that's been published. Each of these books is a great book. And actually, if you really want to get to the roots of unsustainable economies and how we got here, American Possible, but Gus Speth, actually a neighbor here at the law school, is a fantastic. It's one of the best ways that I've seen to capture the failures of the economic system and why we are in such a big mess right now. Great, let's go next. So before then we sort of try to tap into that place of caring, I just want to share a little bit of a series of stories, or some stories from Vermont. This goes back to the work that we did in October with the idea that we wanted to provide a sense of the possible. And the basic question was, can Vermont, at this time, with all the work that has happened over the past decades, and all the work to become a greener state, or a green state, can Vermont amount to that example, or to that model of how we could design a system, especially from the economic point of view? So that was sort of the question. And that it's actually a small publication that we did, and it's available online. So we started with the idea that Vermont has a story to tell, and many, of course, but a larger story to tell.
And the story is about the creativity and the challenges of putting the economy at the service of its people values. So what we really thought is that Vermont is a good example of people who care. There's no doubt people here care about one another, about the environment. How does that manifest itself in the design of an economic system? Can we actually have a theory that if you care, then you design a system differently? And so that's where we capture some of the stories. And because we didn't want to get lost in too many hundred stories or few good stories, we wanted to have an organizing principle a little bit that guided us in telling a story. So our organizing principle was the idea that, well, first of all, the economy is just a mean to an end. It should be. What happened over time, in the course of time, is that it seems almost that the economy has, as an end result or an end goal, just growth. Is that all we want from the economy? So the assumption was we want something different. So the view that is emerging in the design of, in the thinking about a new economic system is actually about what the economy is really for. So if that's what it is for, our ultimate end of the economy is actually people's well-being and happiness. So how can we tell a story from all the other layers that inform that process? So we thought, well, an economy that cares is an economy that protects healthy ecosystems, but also it doesn't allow ag land to be lost, for example, to other land uses. And so we actually had examples of stories about these ultimate means. So our ultimate means being the biocapacity that we have in Vermont and the values that people have in communities. And then intermediate means would be actually where all the exchanges, all the ways that we can take raw materials but also services from nature and from our communities and turn them into products but also into interactions, into services. And so all the exchanges that we have, the type of businesses, who owns, who doesn't own either land or companies, how you own, they're all inputs for a different way of doing the economy. And the things that you want out of the economy, which we call intermediate ends at that point, so all the things we need actually out of an economy, it's all about actually how more accessible to the widest number of people those things are. So those were the sort of the inspiring principles for capturing some of these stories. So we gather stories from here, from there. So here, one thing that we did was to provide a lot of numbers. The stories are not really about numbers here. What's the most important is, and I'll be quick on this actually, is that what we thought was very important in terms of the ultimate means of an alternative economy is actually the value system. The value system that inspires the protection of our landscapes, for example. And so here, the number you can see is actually 97% of Vermonters value working lands. And so that is a super number. All of us. So it's a measure of care, of course. And then there's stories about alternative ownership models and experiments, not having to own necessarily a parcel of land, but you can actually share a piece of land with others and manage it sustainably as a whole. So I'm not going to go into the details, but we capture a lot of these stories. And going up into the ladder of what cares in an economy, then the thing that emerges the most and is the most interesting is the power networks in Vermont. So whether you deal with the food system or whether you deal with transition to a renewable energy system, the networks are really key. Networks of organizations. I'm thinking of Farm to Play, for example, where they started small, they had a group of was 30 organizations. There are now over 300 organizations being part of that network. And they operate under the principle that all interested parties need to be part of the same thinking and so the same brainstorming about how to redesign a food system and increase local production and jobs, of course, and care for the soils and all of those characteristics. So that is really coming out as the strong story there, which is, if we remember the iceberg model, the networks is that structural element in a system that actually allows a system to become more adaptive and evolve more quickly. So that's very interesting. And the most leverage that we find in different stories that are happening in Vermont, well, you heard about the discussion about the public banking, of course. So there's a lot of discussion there. But the whole idea of redirecting capital. So on one end is the strong divestment movement, but also the idea of moving money out of Wall Street to Main Street. And so that whole discussion is also very present in Vermont, and redesigning the type of capital that you want to attract, Asian capital, for example. So this circled area was actually to mention the debt service that Vermont is paying because we don't have a public bank in Vermont. So it was just one idea, and actually our institute released a study on how it would look like if we had a public bank in Vermont. And the interest for us to do so was actually to promote a healthy conversation about the topic and create a sense of curiosity about this discussion that tends to actually become quite polarized. I don't know exactly for what reason we sort of end up at that level. But, and so, and the whole creativity goes into different kind of exchanges, different ways to exchange things, either with local currencies or other ways. I'm not going to say too much about that. Let's go to the next. And we found incredible stories, of course, that you're all familiar with, the great strong CSA system in Vermont and the Italian degrees. I'm not going to go into details, but I wanted to actually draw attention to some of the numbers. Again, unfortunately not showing it very well. Can you go to the next? And here, 1,700 is actually the number of jobs that would be created if we increase the local production of food by 5%. So that's an interesting, important story to tell. Another story or another number that if I just say the number, it remains a number, but it would deserve a story.
Oh, nice.
Wow. That makes a huge difference. Thank you. Is that of children in Vermont who are food insecure, which is still a big number. And so that is one of the sad part of the story. So the stories that we try to tell when looking at Vermont sometimes are a mixed bag, of course. There's a lot of challenges still to be reached, to be working on. Let's keep going. And this is sort of the last page of our publication, actually, on the fact that we are the first state in the U.S. to legislate a new way to measure the economy, which is the Genuine Progress Indicator, which is alternative to the gross domestic product. And that's huge. That's huge because so there's only Maryland who has the GPI actually approved at the state level. Vermont, though, is the first one to fully legislate for it. And it's a different way of measuring the economy in the sense that it's a reality check on the economic system. Anything that moves the economy or moves through the economy with GDP is actually a plus. It's considered like a plus. So you have anything that is even kind of bad, like a crime. So you have expenditures that go into either improving the locks in your door because you live in a very dangerous area. All those expenses, defensive expenses, they count as a positive in the GDP. And by converse, if you look at the alternative measure of the economy, GPI detracts those costs that actually a minus. It takes us far away actually from well-being. So anything that detracts from our well-being is considered a minus. And what's considered the plus is actually everything that adds to your well-being. So including caring for your neighbors, household work, and of course ecosystem services that we get from nature that normally don't get accounted for in any possible way. So it's a well thought out process and system to capture a lot of the things that are not captured. So that's a good story. What is the problem with that? Is that it's kind of geeky and it's kind of complicated. We have 26 indicators, and what does it really mean? The good part of this is that our institute started working with a network of key players at the state level who are very interested in any of the different dimensions of the GPI around the idea of how do we create a culture of genuine progress. What does it mean, progress? Genuine relative to what? And so the conversation is coming out of academia, and is coming out of the state house. It's becoming more tangible for people who work actually in the field. Just the last number to mention here. It's the biggest deduction, the biggest minus that we have in the genuine progress indicator is inequality in income in Vermont, which has increased by 29% between 1970 and 2010. So that's a huge number, and that's a huge deduction from a measure of essentially economic well-being. So one question is also how we actually can work collectively on a problem like this. It could be that we have some policies that are addressing that. It could be that the food system is actually thinking about how in the food system income inequality looks like. So the idea is, how can we use a map essentially of our economic well-being to actually capture some of the issues and work systemically around those. And then of course the first reaction could be problem solving, but then the question here, what we're trying to think about more tonight is more, we have that issue, an important issue, but then what would be a vision of a state or of a nation where actually income is distributed more equally? What would that mean? What would that look like or feel like? So again, to sort of remind us of that difference between problem solving, feeling bad and acting on it immediately, versus step back for a second and look at the picture that comes from a vision of what it would look like. Because I honestly also have not spent time thinking about it. What does it mean?
Awesome.
All right. So I think we're doing well on time. And so as we transition into a moment of reflection, I would like to keep this one up for questions. Maybe we'll take some questions, and then I would like to move into part 2 of the evening. So any reaction or thoughts that come to you as I spoke for almost an hour? Yes?
The income equality figure, what is that based on? Is it age, gender, race, educational level, or a combination of all those things?
It's essentially a measure of the inequality distribution through the Gini coefficient. So how income is actually distributed across the different sectors of society. So it's really that measure, and I can go more into the details. But yeah.
So I mean, that's kind of like looking at the money side of it, and which does tend to parallel the happiness thing in the bottom end of the scale. And I mean, I would think to equalize things would be to make sure that where people get good, better food. A lot of them don't even know how to cook. They're so busy.
Yeah, you can take those questions in any system really. It could be how do you actually have people have more access to food and cooking better. Indeed, so there's so many of these stories that are not fully sort of addressed and fully envisioned in a way. So I agree. One thing that I should mention is that yes, in Vermont we do have an alternative measure of the economy, which is the GPI, the General Progress Indicator. But that can be also seen as a transitional measure, and in reality we should aim for real well-being and happiness I mean, what if we actually talked about happiness in our economic system as the ultimate goal of our economy? But that word, happiness, is kind of a taboo with legislators. You can talk about happiness. You can talk about love. You can talk about all these soft, wonderful things that actually we all crave for. Other comments on this before we sort of transition? Yes.
I really like the way you made a distinction between what you can do with a problem, because I can see so many examples of problem solving in a reactive mode. I mean, almost all of our laws are kind of from that place. You know, they're all, here's a problem, we need to fix it, let's make a new rule. And so now we have so many laws and so many experts that are supposed to keep us safe and tell us, you know, you have to ask, you can't figure out how to do it on your own. You have to ask, you know, this committee to give you approval, you know. So that kind of problem solving mode has really gotten us into a huge pickle, you know, because our government has grown so large that it's borrowing more money every year than it can ever, you know, right now we're way beyond where we can ever pay back what we owe, you know, which has some serious problems down the road, but, and it's all because of that kind of reactive mode of thinking, you know.
Yeah, well, I do see that. You know, it's like the tip of the iceberg, right? So it's like being staying at that level. So you're in that reactive mode, and then oftentimes that's all we talk about is about the tax rate or the interest rate. It's all those kind of fine measures, but they are not really discussions about the whole system. And so, indeed, absolutely. So that's a very valid point. And Chuck?
Yeah, Marta, I totally agree with what you say about, you know, the stories. I mean, the pursuit of happiness is embedded in our very founding and in our political system. And we've totally been sold a bill of goods that the pursuit of happiness equals the pursuit of goods and things. We buy more things, we make more goods, then we'll all somehow be happy. And of course, that's where the underlying fallacy really lies. But that's where all the stories get told, because the people who sell the big goods and the big services make the most money, so they can control the story and they can tell the story. What you talked about, that the people at Northern Woodlands couldn't afford to get their story out, and that really kind of portrays what the situation is, that the Walmarts of the world can get their story out. But
Yeah.
the real source of happiness, which is going out into a well-managed woodland and being a part of nature, that might appear in a novel somewhere, but it's pretty hard to get that story out. And I think that's the issue for me that we have to come to grips with, is what you exactly talked about, which is how to frame our story, because we have to first of all frame the story to understand that the pursuit of happiness is not the pursuit of things. And then we have to create that story, and then we have to find a way to share that story. So thank you.
Yeah, and this sharing is very important, because it's also who do we need to have with us or as part of our stories to make that story true also. So that it's not just our sort of, you know, it's not our story of this group of people who want to change the world, right? So you make inclusive narratives. And that's one challenge that, for example, the new economy movement is facing a lot. So in the sense that there's that sense of emergence and need to converge around an idea, but then people are coming from all walks of activism and from labor movement, from environmental movement, and then they have this different way of speaking different languages, and that becomes a barrier oftentimes. And then oftentimes also the word new is scary. It's like, and so maybe it's better to go about the new part that is emerging in terms of what is the shared intention, what we are all in it together. And so it becomes also an issue of language, and that's what I'm encountering a lot. So thanks for the comment. And we have Simon and then two people here.
So just looking at the chart here that you have up here, which compares the kind of generative loop to the reactive loop. And I think that as modes of organizing, the bottom one is sort of like in the protest politics, and the top one is more like the transition town model that you mentioned earlier. My question is, certainly this presents it with a bias to the top side of the spectrum, as being something which is an emerging model, and we're moving away from an emphasis of protest politics and towards an emphasis on more generative approach to organizing. But my question is it possible that that we don't have value in the bottom side of this? Is it? I mean, I think that we think of them as we need both, but maybe we need more generative than reactive. But is it possible that we are going to move towards a situation where we don't benefit from the lower side of this diagram, and the only value is in the top side? This is a question for you in terms of your own personal opinion.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. And yeah, you're right. I mean, we do need both at this very moment. There are acute problems that require immediate intervention. But then, for me, sometimes the question is, how do you turn a problem into a vision? And so that's actually an exercise that I'd like to go through with you in the rest of the hour that we will have. So I think if we start framing problems and turning them into visions as well, I think that's exactly going to that direction. And I don't necessarily see this as just being the future. It happens already a lot. And so some of the stories of Vermont, for example, they're not stories that necessarily come from here. We had 97% of Vermonters caring for the working lands. That means something. That means that many other stories that I mentioned in a kind of fragmented way, that means that they inform those other stories as well. The CSA movement, which is the strongest in the US. I mean, that all comes from that sort of bottom of caring, which has already happened. So my response to you is we don't have to reinvent everything. It's already there, except that we are not seeing it, or we're not capturing it enough through our stories. We had two people on the front. Yes.
About a week ago, I was halfway around the world, and this very subject was being spoken at the internet from my cousin who attended a lecture by someone who's retiring from a sustainable living organization, and it was the same thing we're talking about right now.
Oh, fantastic! You see,
it's all around the world. It's really the same thing, especially with storytelling. And one of the stories that I thought when we were talking about this was the story of sustainable living that Jim Parker came up with, that we had to get off of this fossil fuel. And it was selling for a while. And then Ronald Reagan came in with another story.
right? Yeah.
A whole other story. It's just...
Yeah, so stories can be very powerful as they represent visions, but then we want generative stories. So that's going to be our focus. So thanks for sharing. I guess we take two more questions here. You had a question?
I don't know exactly if it's a question, but something you said really struck me, and that is, forget the reactionaries. I think you said that at some point. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, because you're talking about let's be inclusive, but how inclusive do we really have to be to shift the paradigm? What percentage of the population needs to go along with the story? And if we can really forget the reactionaries, and you're not always thinking about, when you live in a democracy, everybody has to eventually agree, and you've got to kind of convince these or whatever. But I love that idea of, there's certain people they'll come along soon enough, but
Yeah, engineers have a wonderful way to see, to describe the sort of the adoption curve of new technology. And so they have the early adopter, the innovators, then the early adopters, then the curious half of the majority, and then the ones that need to go along, and then the ones that forget about them. So it was really, it's very nice. So I'd be happy to share that literature. But that's an important point. Of oftentimes we hear some of the most vocal minorities are minorities, and I found that I do have a story about actually a movement started in Burlington by me on non-citizen voting in local elections. So I don't go into detail, but what happened was in the end, a lot of the exposure that we got in the media created a strong reaction from a very vocal minority, and that was it. And I knew that a large majority of people in Burlington would care about having people who have lived in the community for more than 20 years vote in local elections for the mayor, for the council, in the schools, things like that. So that's sort of very helpful to know where we should spend our time and energy. And we take one last question and we move into our second part of the evening. All right.
I just wanted to comment that I think stories can be, there's many different levels to stories. And from an early age, whenever we turn on the TV, whenever we go to a movie, we're being given a story of how to live our life. Like what kinds of activities we need to do in order to live our life. You know, we need to get a job, and have a car, and have an apartment or a house. Mm-hmm. We need to have a dog and a cat. So it's a vision. It's like a role model. And it's very rare to see a role model that doesn't conform to those parameters, you know. It's very rare to see someone like living in an intentional community. I mean, when's the last time you saw a sitcom about people living on an intentional community? It would be a great sitcom, probably. But so I think that the stories that we need to perhaps, or someone needs to adopt, are like a totally different way of living our life. And once people who are still not sure about how to live their life, young people and other people who are like at transition points in their life, if they can pick up on those stories, see those shows or see those plays or read that novel or whatever, I think that might actually go a really long way in terms of changing the emergent kind of paradigm.
That is a big discussion. I mean, there is a current discussion across many statewide organizations, at least here, but I'm sure it's shared elsewhere, of how we cooperate to have messaging that really reaches beyond our individual stories of our organization or the next feel-good story. So I agree. And there's great work by the Population Media Center, actually, on developing soap operas, in particular to lower population in developing countries, in which they use role models a lot of sort of women that study for a long period of time, that take their lives in their hands. So, and they developed a whole theory how you capture social norms in a place to sort of change those social norms. So that's very interesting social cognitive behavior work, social work. So, great. So maybe we'll just change the tone a little bit, because I've been guilty of having become too intellectual in the way I expressed some of these ideas. And so it was coming definitely from a place of caring, but it's not always easy to sort of transition from the mind to the heart. So what we'll do, and I'll try my best to be with you in this process, we're going to do a guided meditation that is going to last around 10 minutes. And after that, we'll make sure that you'll have cards in which you can record some of your impressions. And you probably are not going to see me, but it's okay, you're going to hear me. And we're going to be with our closed eyes anyway. And in the end, I just want you to sort of be willing to experiment in this and be understanding that it's also the first time ever that I do something like this with a group of people. So use your compassion at your best. And we're just going to talk about it afterwards. And if you don't feel connected, you don't feel connected, everything is okay and fine. So we we're going to start by closing our eyes and just finding a good, comfortable position with our chairs so that our feet are comfortably on the ground. And we're going to start by paying slowly more and more attention to how we get support from our chair. Just feel how your feet are placed on the ground and how the chair is actually supporting you in different points of your body. And oftentimes in our lives, we neglect to recognize the role of who supports us. And it might come in the form of people, but also floors or chairs. Just let yourself observe that very body of yours that is supported and connected to the chair. And if you find your mind wandering around a little bit, just bring it back gently to the bodily sensation of being supported by your chair. We oftentimes have judgment going on within ourselves. We have commentary going on at all times. Our mind is rarely the time to really focus on what it feels to be an embodied person. So, acknowledge that feeling.
Could you speak up a little louder? Please.
So let's acknowledge that feeling of being an embodied person. And if judgment comes, discomfort comes, just observe it and keep it there and acknowledge it. And as we start feeling a little more comfortable in that observing mode of feeling our body connected to support, but also just the feeling of being here, then let's focus a little bit more about the very reason that brought you here, that brought you to the work that you do in your life. And let's focus for a moment on a possible feeling of maybe frustration or disillusionment or struggle, anything that you find hard sometimes as you do your work in your daily life, at home, or in your organization, in your community. It has to do with the burnout that we talked about. And sometimes we feel that sense of exhaustion, responsibility, carrying that load with us. Let's just feel for a moment what that feels like in your body. Where is that located in your body? And let's just observe it without needing to do anything about it. Just leaving it there been there for a reason. It's been with you and it's known to you. And you're welcome to stay in this reflective mode as long as you want. But if you feel that there's a little bit more space that is created for you to breathe more easily as a result of observing, maybe from that place you can actually remember the energy that you had with you when you started thinking of the work, of the change that you wanted to see in the world or around you. What is that vision, an original desire? What does it feel like in your body? Can you locate in your body that experience, that feeling of energy that ripples through your body? It's actually being there all along, and it's there at times, or for some people, actually always. How does that manifest itself in your body? And just rest in that place of inspiration, of energy, that is in reality who you are. And when you're ready, but no hurry, just slowly come back to the room and maybe wiggle the toes, wiggle the tips of your fingers, and gently open your eyes without looking at anything in particular, but just having that gentle gaze. Maybe a smile on your face as you open your eyes. And let's just become more aware of the place where we come back to. And listen to our body. You might need a stretch. You might want to smile at other people. It's just a slow rekindle with one another in this room. And as we slowly re-emerge from this experience, let's take a time to reflect about what it felt like to be connected to a place of frustration or a place of joy and energy, anything that you had experienced. And if you you didn't connect, why not? So it's anything is possible, anything is accepted. So we'll do that by passing around cards where you can actually reflect a little bit, and for a few more minutes. And it is okay to feel kind of without that sort of energy of wanting to go and fix the world. It's a different kind of energy that we actually. All right, so thanks for taking the time for doing that. We think that's very important, and a very important point from where to start into our next phase for the night. So bring some of these reflections into your group work. So let's go to the slide where actually we can explain the group work. This was an image that actually was supposed to inform us in our meditation as we go from here to here. But so the proposition here would be, the idea would be to actually stand and get re-energized, so transition from that energy of reflection into bringing that aspiration, that energy into your group work. So we're going to break up into groups of maybe 5 or 6, and we have 2 questions for you. We'll be followed by the discussion that we have had so far and by our guided meditation. So take a problem in your community and turn it into a vision, a story. What would my community look like without that problem? So it's like, instead of jumping into problem solving, how you turn that problem into a vision. And it could be then in your group of 5 or 6 people, maybe you have multiple problems that might emerge. See if you can sort of tell one story or focus on particular one that is brought up by any member of the group. And very importantly, as we also want our stories and our visions to be as shared as possible, because otherwise a vision that is not shared, it doesn't have that power. So who should be part of that vision to make it true? Would we see any CEOs of companies here tonight? We have one here. Great. So my assumption is not entirely correct that we didn't have a wide group.
One employee and one CEO.
Great. That was just beyond.